I want you to picture a village. And I don't mean some, generic fairy tale village.
Yeah.
I want you to imagine a very specific, rugged kind of place in the Balkans. It's tight-knit. Everyone knows your grandfather's name.
Right?
Everyone eats the same food, probably peppers and beans. Everyone is struggling to scrape a living out of the same patch of rocky soil.
It sounds idyllic in a rough sort of way, doesn't it?
It does on the surface, but in the region we're talking about today, that surface is incredibly thin.
Exactly. Because now I want you to imagine there's an invisible line running right down the middle of the street. Or maybe it runs right through your living room.
Okay.
On one side of that line, you're a patriot. You belong. You're safe. On the other side, you're a traitor.
A very dangerous label.
And the difference between those two labels, between being safe and being a target, might just come down to which church you walked into on Sunday, or what language you whispered to your kids when the shutters were closed. That is a much darker picture, but unfortunately, a very historically accurate one. You're setting the scene for one of the most complex and frankly painful identity struggles in Southern Europe.
Today on The Deep Dive, we are tackling a term that, to an outsider, might sound like a medical condition.
Yeah, it does.
Or maybe a psychological diagnosis. But in the history of northern Greece and Macedonia, it was a label that could literally decide whether you lived or died. We're talking about the Grkoman.
Or Grkomanos, depending on who's doing the talking.
Okay.
It's a term that carries about a century of baggage.
Right. And we have a really fascinating stack of notes and research to get through today. We're going to look at the etymology. We've got some intense case studies from the Florina region, and we're going to trace this whole concept all the way across the ocean to the suburbs of Toronto, Canada.
It's a massive topic.
Yeah.
And I think we need to set the ground rules right up front.
Yeah.
This isn't just dusty academic history. This is about blood, loyalty, and these traitor narratives that are still really raw for a lot of people.
Absolutely.
So our mission here isn't to take a side. We're not here to say who was right and who was wrong in the struggle for Macedonia.
No, absolutely not. We're just the guides through the paperwork.
Exactly. Our goal is to use the source material to understand why this distinction even exists. We want to understand the mechanics of how a person's identity gets rewritten, sometimes by force, sometimes by choice, and what that does to a family over generations.
So let's start with the word itself. Grkoman. When I first read this in the prep notes, my brain went straight to Beatlemania. It sounds like a fandom.
Linguistically, you've pretty much nailed it. That is what it means. It's a kind of fandom, but with much, much higher stakes.
Okay.
It's a compound word. You have the root gruk, which just means Greek, and then you have the suffix mimani.
Which comes from mania.
Yes. Obsession, madness. So if you translate it literally, it means a mania for being Greek.
Okay, but here's where I get stuck. Mania for being Greek sounds like it could almost be a compliment, like someone who just really loves Greek culture, the history.
Like an Anglophile or a Francophile.
Right. An Anglophile loves England, a Francophile loves French wine.
That is the trap.
Yeah.
Because in this specific historical context, it is absolutely not a compliment.
Okay.
It wasn't a term people put on their business cards. It was a slur. It was a derogatory label used by ethnic Macedonians to describe other Macedonians.
So it's an accusation. It's not something you call yourself. It's something you get called.
Precisely. It's a call out. The implication is just heavy with sarcasm. The people using this word were saying, look at him. He has this mania to be Greek. He's trying so hard.
But the subtext is...
The subtext is, he isn't really Greek.
That's brutal. It's essentially gatekeeping identity.
It is. The source material defines a Grkoman specifically as someone who is ethnically one thing Slavic or Macedonian by blood, language, and heritage, but who culturally or politically identifies as Greek.
So, to the person pointing the finger, usually an ethnic Macedonian nationalist, a Grkoman is the ultimate betrayer. They're not just an enemy, they're a turncoat.
Precisely. It's the accusation of turning your back on your blood. And to understand why that stung so much, we have to look at the religious aspect. You can't separate this from the church.
Right.
The sources highlight this big split between the patriarchists and the exarchists.
And this is the late 19th, early 20th century, right? Before the borders were even really drawn.
Correct. This is effectively the struggle for Macedonia.
Yeah.
You had people in these villages who spoke Slavic dialects, but the church they attended signaled their political allegiance. If you stuck with the Patriarchate of Constantinople...
That's the Greek Orthodox Church.
Right. If you stayed loyal to them, you were aligning yourself with Hellenism, even if you couldn't speak a word of Greek at your dinner table.
And the alternative.
Conversely, if you joined the Bulgarian Exarchate or, wanted an independent church, you were signaling a Slavic or Macedonian consciousness.
So the label Grkoman was essentially born in the church pews. It meant you were Greek by choice rather than Greek by blood.
And that distinction, that phrase by choice, is what I want to really dig into, because the sources present a really complicated view of what choice actually means in this part of the world.
That was a part of the research that really stopped me in my tracks. Because when we say identity politics today, we usually mean how people express themselves. We think of it as internal. Who do I feel like? But looking at the mechanics of identity switching in these notes, it doesn't seem like internal feelings had much to do with it at all.
No. For the vast majority of these people, becoming a Grkoman wasn't some ideological epiphany. They didn't wake up one morning and say, you know what? I have discovered a deep love for Pericles and the classics.
It wasn't a philosophical choice?
No, it was a survival mechanism.
Survival against what, specifically?
Against the crushing pressure of the state. You have to look at the timeline. After the Balkan Wars, around 1913, the borders harden. The region becomes northern Greece.
Okay.
And suddenly, if you're speaking a Slavic dialect, you are a problem for the state. You're a suspect population.
And the sources mention the Metaxas regime in the 1930s as being particularly brutal in this regard.
Oh, the Metaxas dictatorship turned up the heat significantly. We're talking about active, forced assimilation. There were heavy fines for speaking the Macedonian language. Heavy fines. People were imprisoned. Some were exiled to these dry, barren islands as political prisoners.
I read about the castor oil. That detail seemed incredibly cruel.
Yes. It was a common punishment used by the regime's police. Being forced to drink castor oil if you were caught speaking the wrong language, it's humiliating and painful.
Wow.
So put yourself in the shoes of a farmer in Florina in, say, 1936. You have land, you have a family to feed, you want your son to get a job in the civil service, or just not get beaten up by the police. What do?
You adapt. You get quiet. You camouflage yourself.
You do more than get quiet. You perform loyalty. You send your kids to the Greek school, not just because you want them educated, but because it proves you're good.
And you change your name.
You change your name. The text gives that specific example, changing a surname like Lazenka's to Lazaridis.
That's such a clear signal. You're Hellenizing the label on your mailbox to match the government's expectations.
It's a tool for social mobility and just basic safety. If you wanted to avoid harassment, you adopted the Greek identity.
Yeah.
But there was another pressure factor here, which the notes call the prosfigi factor.
The refugees. This adds a whole other layer of economic tension, doesn't it?
Right. After the catastrophe in 1922, the war between Greece and Turkey, there's a massive population exchange. Huge numbers of Greek refugees from Asia Minor, the prosfigi, were settled in these exact regions in northern Greece.
So now you're a local Slavic speaker, and suddenly thousands of people who are culturally Greek, who speak the language fluently, and who are fiercely loyal to the state because the state saved them,
are settled right next door to you.
Right.
And the government favors them. They're the reliable citizens. So the competition for land and resources just spikes.
And the locals, the Slavic speakers, suddenly have to prove they're Greek enough to compete.
And some of them doubled down. They became super Greeks to prove their loyalty wasn't suspect.
And I imagine to their neighbors who refused to assimilate, the ones who held on to the Macedonian identity, that looked like the ultimate betrayal, like they were selling out the community for a leg up.
Exactly. Why are you acting more Greek than the Greeks? You're a Grkoman.
It creates this incredibly tense dynamic. It's not just the government versus the people, it's neighbor versus neighbor.
Which brings us down to the village level. I think it's easy to talk about this in abstract terms, nationalism, assimilation, but the sources give us a really vivid, almost cinematic look at the Larinsko region. That's the area around Florina, and this concept of the Grkoman village.
This is where the geography of identity gets fascinating. The polarization was so intense that entire villages would get categorized. If a village remained loyal to the Greek cause, the Macedonian movement would label the whole place a Grkomansko silo, a Grkoman village. It's like branding cattle. But the most heartbreaking stories aren't between villages, they're inside them. The case study of Nevelini, also known as Skopje. That one really stuck with me.
Nevelini is a perfect microcosm. It sits right in the crosshairs. The source describes how, even before the big wars, the village was split by that social wall we talked about.
The social wall. That phrase is so heavy. Because physically, there is no wall. You can see your neighbor hanging laundry. You can smell their cooking.
Physically, you're living in the same ecosystem. You're farming the same soil. and you're speaking the exact same local dialect over the fence. Because remember, even the Grkoman spoke the Slavic dialect at home.
Right.
But because your parents sent you to the Greek school and your neighbor went to the Bulgarian or Macedonian school, you are living in two different universes.
You go to different churches, you celebrate different holidays, or maybe the same holidays on different days. You don't intermarry. It's like living in parallel dimensions.
It is a complete bifurcation of life. And the tragedy is that this wall ran right through living rooms. We have accounts of families split right down the middle.
This is the brother versus brother trope, but it's real-life history.
It is. One brother joins the Macedonian partisans, the NOF fighting for minority rights or autonomy. The other brother aligns with the Greek authorities.
He becomes the Grkoman.
He becomes the Grkoman.
I have to ask, is that always about ideology, or is that a strategy too? Like hedging your bets?
That is the cynical but probably accurate interpretation. It's a desperate balancing act. If one brother is a rebel, the family is in danger of losing everything.
Okay.
But if the other brother is a collaborator or a patriot, depending on your view,
Maybe.
just maybe, he can talk to the police. Maybe he can stop them from confiscating the farm.
So they cancel each other out to save the house.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
But then the war starts.
Yeah.
The real shooting war. And this label, Grkoman, stops being just an insult you throw around at the coffee shop.
Yeah.
During the Greek Civil War, from 1946 to 1949, it becomes a death sentence.
This is where the stakes escalate terrifyingly. The sources mention that in the eyes of the Macedonian partisans, a Grkoman wasn't just a sellout anymore. They were an informant.
Synonymous with traitor. If a villager was seen speaking to a Greek officer, or if they were known to support the government, they were branded.
And what happened?
And the text describes a horrific cycle of violence. Partisans would punish, beat, or even execute Grkomani for treason against the Macedonian cause.
And the Greek state, they weren't exactly gentle either.
Not at all. The Greek state would punish the Slav Macedonians for subversion. They'd imprison them, confiscate property, or execute them for supporting the communists.
So the villagers are caught in this lethal vice.
Completely. If you don't act Greek enough, the state destroys you. If you act too Greek, the partisans might come for you in the night.
It's a nightmare. There is no safe option. You just have to pick which danger you can live with.
And that pressure cooker forced a consolidation of identity. We talked about the name changes earlier, Gulev becoming Gulinis.
Yep.
The source notes that for many, this transition, which might have started as a mask, eventually became the face.
How so?
Well, think about the children growing up in that environment. If your father changes the name to Galini to save the farm, and he strictly forbids you from speaking the old language because he knows it could get you killed, what happens?
You grow up only knowing Greek. You grow up waving the flag. You believe the narrative because it's the only one you've ever been allowed to hear.
Exactly. You grow up as a fierce Greek patriot. The survival strategy of the father becomes the genuine identity of the son. The memory of the old identity is erased, intentionally, for safety.
So the Grkoman label, which started as an insult for a fake Greek, eventually creates real Greeks.
In a way, yes. It solidified the population and completed the assimilation process through trauma.
But the story doesn't end in the village, does it? This is the part that I found most surprising. A lot of these people left. They fled the war, the poverty, the division, and they ended up in Toronto.
The transatlantic baggage. This is a fascinating part of the source material. We're looking at the diaspora in Canada, particularly in the 1940s and 50s.
You'd think moving across the Atlantic Ocean would wipe the slate clean. New country, new start, maple syrup, hockey. Who cares what village your grandfather was from?
You would think so.
Yeah.
But it turns out you can pack a lot of history into a suitcase. The immigrants from the Lurin region brought the labels with them.
The division didn't dissolve.
It just relocated to a new climate.
How did that play out in Canada?
It dictated everything. The text mentions that the community split instantly. You have the older Greek churches and social clubs, and then you had the newer Macedonian churches. Your family history back in Nevelini determined which door you walked through in Toronto.
So if your dad was a Grkoman in the village, you went to the Greek club on Danforth Avenue.
Exactly. And if your family were exarchists, you went to the Macedonian Hall. They didn't mix. You could have cousins living in the same city, working in the same factories, who wouldn't speak to each other because of that invisible line back in the village.
It's amazing how memory works. The sources mention the elders in the Greater Toronto area.
Yes. It says the oral history is incredibly stubborn. Even decades later, the elders know exactly which families in the old village were ours and which were Grkoman.
Wow.
It's a sharp edge that never quite dulled, even in the safety of the suburbs. You can't escape the label.
And does the source mention if this term is still used today? Or is it sort of fading out with that older generation?
It's definitely quieter, but it hasn't vanished. The source says modern usage still carries that sting. It's used in northern Greece and within the diaspora to criticize those who deny an ethnic Macedonian identity.
So as long as the underlying question of who are we remains.
The labels remain.
It's heady stuff. So let's try to pull this all together. What does this deep dive actually tell us? We started with a linguistic compound, Grek plus money.
We moved from a word to a survival strategy. We saw how education and the church created a divide. Then we saw how the Metaxas regime and the Civil War weaponized that divide.
Turning neighbors into informants and traitors.
Exactly. And finally, we saw how it became this lasting memory, a ghost that followed people halfway around the world to Canada.
So what's the big takeaway here?
I think the big takeaway for me, connecting all this, is that identity in this region wasn't just about who you are in your soul. It wasn't a luxury of self-expression. It was about who you had to be to survive.
That's the key, isn't it? It's easy to judge from the outside or from history books and say, oh, he was a traitor or he was a patriot. But when you're the guy trying to keep his farm or keep his kids out of jail,
the choices become much, much grayer. And those choices echo. They change the language your grandchildren speak. They change the spelling of your last name on your passport. And they change the stories you tell yourself about who you are.
It leaves us with a really provocative thought to chew on, specifically looking at that generational shift we talked about. If your great-grandfather changed his name from Lysenkis to Lazaridis to save his farm in 1936, and today you only speak Greek, and you love Greece, and you consider yourself 100% Greek, does that make the label Grkoman just a historic insult? Or is that label actually the secret history of your survival?
That is the question. Is it a mark of shame, or is it a badge of what it took to endure? I think the answer depends entirely on which side of the fence or the church aisle you're standing on.
And maybe that fence is still there, even if it's invisible. Thank you for listening to this deep dive. It's a complex history, but one worth understanding.
Absolutely. Keep asking questions.
See you next time.